I figured since the last video was about the DCI, I would double down and go ahead and make another DCI video. Ultimately, that discussion from last night ended up coming from a little concept. Also, ignore the voice. Apparently my little anger spout yesterday completely ruined my voice. Ignore it, please. Anyway, that original concept, that being the discussion of the DCI, actually came from a concept that a few of my friends have been talking about recently, that being the idea of Lefty DCI. However, a lot of people don't accept it because they don't even believe the DCI exist. And I feel like I need to make it apparent that the DCI most certainly exists. Now, this is coming from someone that actually believed that the DCI didn't exist because their characters, they're just particularly unsatisfying to have their just arc be, oh, they were the toy animatronics and then what happened to them. We don't particularly end up learning all that much about them, especially considering that since Springtrap was defined as the only real animatronic there, that presumably the DCI never actually passed on because their endoskeletons are somewhere else. However, I don't think that's particularly the case, as within the original Five Nights at Freddy's trilogy, like the original 3 games, the endings such as the Happiest Day and minigames seemingly suggest that the souls are not particularly connected to the animatronic, but rather connected to the casing of the animatronic. Hence why Happiest Day was originally in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, because the souls were inside of the casings. If that's the case, then the toy animatronics being scrapped would seemingly suggest that the casings box that we see in Five Nights at Freddy's 3 would be the ending of their characters. It's only now in the modern day where we've introduced the concept of Remnant, and that is what contains the soul of the children, becomes a bit of a problem, because that means the MCI was never at Fazbear Frights, which is something that I've been saying for a while, but it also means that the DCI are not at Fazbear Frights. Or maybe not. We're not particularly sure. From the sounds of it, they don't particularly have a solid animatronic. However, as we're shown inside of Follow Me, we can see animatronic pieces inside of the back room, fully there inside of Follow Me. So, more notably, I figure it wouldn't particularly be that there weren't any animatronic pieces. I just don't think that any of the pieces were put together into a solid working animatronic. It's like if you walked into an animatronic parts and service room and then tried to get a whole animatronic out of it. You'd most notably find a few arms, maybe some eyeballs, a bunch of metal pieces that you don't know how to put together, but ultimately, unless there's a solid animatronic there, most people don't know how to put it back together in the first place. And if you put it back together, it wouldn't particularly be the same exact animatronic that it was back when it originally existed. So I think most notably what it could be suggesting is that box is more than just the costumes, that box could potentially just have had the pieces of the DCI or the pieces of the toy animatronics endoskeletons at the bottom of the box. However, that is then where the concept of Lefty DCI actually comes from, and that being the fact that we don't know what happened to that metal. It could be inside of the parts and service box in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, or Lefty DCI seemingly suggests that Henry went on to melt down the DCI into it. There is also a third option that I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about, and that is the concept of everything being inside of Molten Freddy. I know that's a bit redundant, but I think it kind of makes sense. It would go against what we're shown inside of Help Wanted, seemingly, as it only shows the MCI during Help Wanted, and specifically the stories are about 5 things becoming 1, not 10 things becoming 1. However, it is still very much a possibility that the toy animatronics as well were then melted down inside of Molten Freddy, so that way there would just be 10 souls inside of Molten Freddy, and it was just the fusion of everything. It would then also mean the toy animatronics were part of Funtime as well, and that they've been here for a very long time. Although the original concepts, as I would go on to talk about, I've had multiple videos where I've tried explaining the events of UCN and how Cassidy can't be the one you should not have killed, and one of them specifically relies on the fact that Molten MCI as a concept was born of 2 ideas, that is the Candy Cadet stories and what were shown in the 4th closet. But in both instances, it only shows the MCI becoming one body. The amalgamation is the 5 MCIs, animatronics, being melted together into one. And the Candy Gadette stories, every single one of them is about 5 things becoming one. Not all of them are about the... Don't be confused, they're not all about Molten Freddy. I don't think that's the case, considering that only 2 of the events actually refer to things, or characters, or people, or children, or whatever you want to say they are, and then the other one refers to a specific set of objects that were turned into one. So I don't think they're particularly all about the same exact event. That would be a little redundant, but rather they've been stuck on my head trying to figure out what they're about. But since both of those ideas are what created the concept of Molten MCI, that would seemingly suggest that there's only 5 souls inside of Molten Freddy. And if that's the case, then again, where did the toy animatronics go? Lefty DCI is a pretty good example of where the toy animatronics could have gone. And I think that's a pretty reasonable idea. There's also the idea that they just melted inside of Fazbear Frights. But either way, I don't think it particularly matters all that much, because we know that they end up moving on. It could potentially suggest that, considering that they're already colored out, and assuming the 5 kids in Happiest Day are the DCI children, that could suggest that the DCI have already moved on, and that they just aren't important anymore. However, when it comes to why people thought the DCI didn't exist, it mostly has to do with the concept of Remnant, which is something that I've been... that's one of the reasons why I personally didn't believe the DCI took place a few months ago, but I ended up changing my tune about that, most notably because the DCI feels like a fairly purposeful event. Most notably, the phone calls seemingly suggest that the animatronics only start misbehaving after the rumors have started going on about the children going missing, seemingly suggesting that yes, it was the DCI that resulted in the toy animatronics misbehaving. Most notably, we end up seeing this during the nights in which William is actually working, in which the toys are still on their stage. They haven't moved. It's only Freddy and the marionette who are moving at that current spot. Well, except for Mangle, who is also moving, but Mangle's always been twitchy. The other characters aren't seemingly chasing after William during the night. It doesn't seem like they have been active since the event of the DCI, not to mention there'd be no point in having a DCI that early in the timeline, because you can't excuse it under the idea of, oh, well, William was just doing an experiment, he was trying to figure out blah 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 blah. The problem with that is Remnant and all of these newer technologies, they're all things from the modern version of Five Nights at Freddy's. They weren't originally intended as part of the original trilogy. That's one of the reasons why the idea that the MCI are inside of the toy animatronics doesn't work, because the concept of Remnant just didn't exist in the original trilogy. Otherwise, we would have seen the endoskeletons of the characters at the end of Five Nights at Freddy's 3 to represent them moving on, but we don't. We see the costumes, because at some period of time, Scott considered the costumes to be where the soul resided in, not the metal that was inside of it. Which again is why I think the most logical sense of what happened to them is they most likely moved on after Fazbear Frights. However, there are people, and some friends of mine, who think that potentially Henry went on to take those endoskeletons and put them inside of the Lefty animatronic. I don't think it's that far-fetched, considering that we know that Henry is the one that's going around buying all of these things. There was an auction after Fazbear Frights in which he bought everything that was there. We can assume that he's the one that's buying all of this stuff, because he's specifically trying to make sure it's all in one place so that everything that Fazbear was can be burned down and gotten rid of. Though it also kind of suggests, well, I suppose Into the Pit's always been weird. I don't know if he would go to Jeff's and collect what was left at Jeff's, but I know for a fact that his main concern was to make sure that the MCI and his daughter moved on during FFPS. He wasn't really particularly all that inticulate about getting rid of the toy animatronics. I wouldn't even be surprised if Henry doesn't even know if the toy animatronics were possessed at any period of time. Even though he was contacted back then, you could potentially use that as an argument for how toys toy Lefty or DCI Lefty DCI, whatever you want to call it, actually happened, that when he was called, that he is the one that, oh, we're trying to get into contact with the Fredbear's Family Diner owner. He shows up, he finds out the animatronics are being scrapped, so he ends up taking the scraps of the animatronics and ends up keeping them until he goes on to build Lefty. That is possible. It is fairly strange. I myself have been having a lot of problems involving those 5 stories, to the point where they've physically gotten into my dreams and I haven't been able to actually get rid of them. I just don't know what they're supposed to represent, and I have been losing sleep and everything because of doing FNAF theorizing. You guys won't believe this, I've had multiple videos planned, but every single one of them sounded fairly harsh. If you thought that last video was bad, there have been a multitude of other videos I've recorded in which I sound worse than I did last night, which is fairly good that I decided not to go with those videos instead. There's a reason why my voice is completely ruined. I've been yelling at the system for a while now. Most notably because the only thing that seems to make me like FNAF theorizing in the first place is passion, just actually wanting to make sure that people are on the right path and not watching people walk themselves into a tunnel of being incorrect. I know a lot of people have their opinions about being incorrect about FNAF theorizing, but there is an incorrect way to do it. At the end of the day, it's not some sandbox mystery. It does have specific information that you are told that you can't just ignore. But I know people are going to throw a fit about that, just like they threw a fit about last night's video. That's just how it is. But ultimately, I do think the DCI exists. I think the DCI most likely moved on after Fazbear Frights. If you want to believe that they're inside of Lefty, I think that's all the power to you, because they did just mysteriously disappear conveniently around when Henry showed up. So I'll let you guys believe whatever you want to believe, because ultimately, those things don't really mean all that much. They're not particularly important to the lore all that much. We know that the toys exist. We know the DCI exists, at least from everything we've seen on the table, seemingly suggesting they exist. So where they went, that is truly something that we can just decide for our own, because I don't think Skakothan all that much cares about the DCI. At the very least, they've never shown up again after the events of FNAF 2, so I don't know. That truly is something that we don't know. But until next time, matane.